Story of the Prophet Elijah. The prophet Elijah is one of the most famous figures in the Bible, and is quoted in both the Old and New Testaments. The story of Elijah played a very active role.
Inscreva-se no nosso canal, deixa seu like, não se esqueça de acionar o sininho das notificações.
In the biblical one. In this study, we learn everything the Bible tells us about who Elijah was. The story of Elijah, O prophet. Elijah lived in the 9th century BC, during the reign of Ahab and Ahaziah in the northern kingdom. Remember, in your days Israel was divided into two kingdoms. Judah is the southern kingdom with its capital in Jerusalem, Israel is the northern kingdom with its capital in Samaria. The Bible does not reveal the personal and family life of the prophet Elijah. We only know that he was a Tishbite who lived in the land of Gilead, east of Jordan. The name Elijah means Jehovah is God. Prophet Elijah and his ministry. Elijah's ministry is recorded in the books of 1 and 2 Kings. His begins without much introduction and ends with a description of his ascension to heaven by a chariot of fire. He was very properly elitist at a very difficult time in the history of teachers at a time. At the time of Elijah, the economic position of the northern kingdom was at its best financially since the separation of the kingdoms after Solomon's death. King Omri, 874 BC, sought good relations with his neighbors. He married his son Ahab to Jezebel, daughter of Eshbaal, king of Sidon. The shooting couple directed, and the Baal gods of Tyre Ahab were even responsible for building a temple to Baal in Samaria. In this turbulent environment of idolatry and paganism, Elijah was called to be God's mouthpiece. He had a duty to remind them that they were the chosen people of the Lord. Elijah's ministry can be divided into 6 important episodes. 1. Warnings about impending drought and its isolation. 2. His battle with the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel. 3. Flights to Horeb. 4. Episodes in Naboth. 5. Ahaziah's prophecy. 6. His translation to Heave. Next, we will look at the 6 most important details in each episode that marks the ministry of the prophet Elijah. Elijah predicts a great drought. In 1 Kings 17, we record the ministry of the prophet Elijah without any introduction. At that time, the prophet Elijah announced that there would be a great drought. We must remember that Baal is the god of life and fertility. Such a drought, therefore, deals a direct blow to the idol's supposed ability to control the weather. After this prophecy, Elijah received divine determinations to go east, hiding by the stream of Cherith. In this place Elijah was miraculously sustained. The water came from the brook itself, and the bread and meat were brought by ravens. 1 Kings 17 verses 2-6. Widow of Sarepta. After the brook dried up due to a severe drought, Elijah was ordered to go to Sarepta in Sidon. There he will be supported by a widow. 1 Kings 17. At first it was thought that the widow who supported the prophet would be a good-looking woman. However, the sequence of biblical texts reveals the dangerous situation in which the woman lived. 1 Kings 17 verse 10 and 12. In a miracle and providence, God increased the widow's supply of flour and oil until the rain returned to the land. 1 Kings 17 verse 14. Still in the same chapter we have the record of the disease that struck the widow's son and eventually died through it. Of this disease. Man of God, what have I to do with you? The phrase suggests that the woman linked the prophet Elijah's visit to her son's illness. She believed that the prophet's presence as a man of God had brought God's attention to her sin. This event would be a great proof of Elijah's status as a teacher prophet. Elijah humiliates the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel. During the drought that Elijah predicted, famine struck Samaria. During this time, Jezebel killed the Lord's prophets. However, there was a man named Obadiah, an officer of Ahab, who managed to hide some of the prophets. Obadiah was also responsible for facilitating the meeting between Elijah and Ahab. Ahab blamed Elijah for Israel's suffering, but the prophet made it clear that he and his family were the real culprits. They sinned against the Lord, especially because of idolatry. 1 Kings 18 verses 17 and 18. Then Elijah the prophet summoned all Israel to appear on Mount Carmel. There, he will face the prophets of Baal and Azera, controlled by Jezebel. 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Azera went up to the mountain. Their two kinds of sacrifices will be offered, one for the heathen and the other for the prophet of the Lord. No one could burn the sacrifices, for the fire had to arise supernaturally. The true God would be the one who burned the sacrifice. The pagans of Baal did everything they could, they even mutilated themselves, but nothing happened. Elijah then repaired the broken altar of the Lord, and asked for water to be poured under the burnt offering. The prophet Elijah cried out to the Lord, the only sovereign God of Israel, and God answered with fire that consumed the burnt offering. 1 Kings 18 verse 23-38. All the people of Israel recognized, crying out, only the Lord is God. On that day the prophets of Baal were killed and a great rain fell on Israel. The drought period had come to an end as Elijah had announced. 1 Kings 18 verse 40 and 41. In this episode we also find another demonstration of God's power in the life of the prophet Elijah. He was able to run ahead of Ahab's chariot all the way to Jezreel. This represented a distance of 30 to 35 kilometers from where they were. Escape to Mount Horeb. After being threatened by Jezebel, Elijah fled south. This was a moment of deep discouragement in the prophet's life. He even wished for death. 1 Kings 19 verses 1-4. However, supernaturally he was divinely fed with bread and water and instructed to head towards Horeb, the mountain of God. The journey took 40 days and 40 nights, and the prophet was sustained only by the meal he had eaten. Mount Horeb was the place where the God of Moses' covenant had made himself known. This indicates that the return of a prophet loyal to God to that place was very significant. On Mount Horeb God gave new vision and new instructions to the prophet Elijah. There he received 3 assignments. 1. Anoint Hazael as king of Syria. 2. Anoint Jehu king of Israel. 3. Anoint Elisha as his successor. It is worth mentioning that the commission concerning Hazael and Jehu was supplemented by Elisha, as the ascension of both the thrones of Syria and Israel, respectively, is recorded in Elisha's ministry. Vineyard of Naboth. In 1 Kings 21, we find yet another great confrontation between the prophet Elijah and the royal family. Jezebel had planned the execution of Naboth, who did not want to give up his vineyard in favor of Ahab. Furthermore, they had ignored the right to the land inheritance that was guaranteed in the nation of Israel. The prophet Elijah announced divine judgment on Ahab and Jezebel, giving details of their deaths and warning that their home would be destroyed. As Ahab repented, the Lord postponed for a generation the destruction of his dynasty, 1 Kings 21-29, but Ahab and Jezebel died dishonorable deaths, as per the prophecy in 1 Kings 22 verses 37 and 38 and the second book of Kings chapter 9. Elijah prophesies against Ahaziah. Ahaziah ascended the throne of Israel, succeeding his father Ahab, 1 Kings 22 verse 52. On one occasion, Ahaziah had an accident that left him crippled. He promptly tried to seek help from the pagan god, ironically called Baal-zebub, which means Lord of the Flies. This was a pun that mocked the name Baal-zebul, which means Lord the Prince. Ahaziah wondered if he could recover from his trouble. But Elijah intercepted Ahaziah's messengers, and ordered them to return to the king, warning him that he had ignored the God of Israel and that he would surely die. Revolted, Ahaziah gave orders for the prophet Elijah to be arrested. He sent a captain with 50 soldiers to meet Elijah at the top of the mountain. However, they all ended up consumed by the fire that descended from the sky. Ahaziah sent another captain with 50 soldiers, and they too were consumed with fire. Insistent, Ahaziah sent another captain with his soldiers. This last captain went up to Elias and begged for his life and for the lives of his soldiers. The prophet Elijah then accompanied him and went before the king to personally deliver his message. Just as Elijah had predicted, Ahaziah did not recover and died, according to Kings chapter 1. Elijah's rapture. The end of Elijah's ministry is recorded in 2 Kings chapter 2. Elisha, and some other prophets, realized that Elijah's ministry was coming to an end, and that he would leave them. Sometimes Elijah tried to distance himself, but Elisha insisted on accompanying him. It is important to remember that Elisha had already been called to succeed the prophet Elijah, 1 Kings 19. Elijah and Elisha went to various places together. After a miracle performed in the Jordan which had its waters divided, Elisha asked for a double portion of his master's spirit. This was a reference to the birthright practiced in Israelite families. In Israel, the firstborn son received a double portion of the family inheritance. Furthermore, he had the right to succeed the patriarch of the house. Elijah's rapture. The end of Elijah's ministry is recorded in 2 Kings chapter 2. Elisha, and some other prophets, realized that Elijah's ministry was coming to an end, and that he would leave them. Sometimes Elijah tried to distance himself, but Elisha insisted on accompanying him. It is important to remember that Elisha had already been called to succeed the prophet Elijah, 1 Kings 19. Elijah and Elisha went to various places together. After a miracle performed in the Jordan which had its waters divided, Elisha asked for a double portion of his master's spirit. This was a reference to the birthright practiced in Israelite families. In Israel, the firstborn son received a double portion of the family inheritance. Furthermore, he had the right to succeed the patriarch of the house, Book of Deuteronomy 21 verse 17. In other words, Elisha was desiring to become Elijah's chief spiritual heir. He didn't want to be exactly twice as powerful as the prophet, as many people imagine. Elisha made a very bold request. Elijah replied that it was not for him, but for God, to decide whether Elisha's request would be granted. The sequence of the biblical text informs us that the granting of this request of Elisha was granted. Elisha saw Elijah ascend to heaven in a whirlwind escorted in a chariot of fire with horses of fire. 2 Book of Kings chapter 2 verse 11.